Wait, don't run away yet. I'm not going to be boring you with the inanities of Japanese strategy RPGs this week. Instead, today's topic is something that's pretty important to classic console gamers like us, or at least something that's going to be important to every console gamer eventually: refurbishing controllers. And I can think of nothing better to inflict today's example on than the most iconic and the most classic piece of gaming hardware of them all: a classic NES controller. If you have any kind of console, you have controllers. And if you have any kind of classic console, you undoubtedly have old controllers. This is a fact of life. If you're going to play or collect classic consoles, you're going to become intimately familiar with fixing old, crusty, worn-out, dirty hardware. And you know the drill with dusty old controllers. Buttons you have to mash really hard to get them to work, or just don't work at all. Cables that only work if you wiggle them. D-pads that go up but not left, and on it goes. These days you probably don't have a choice in buying used hardware for your classic consoles, so if you're forced to invest in some old gear, or if you've just dug out a big old box of childhood memories out of the attic after 20 years, here are a couple of essentials that you should know for refurbishing console controllers. Oh, and I'm going to be just as much of a wordy bastard as ever during this, just so you know. Controllers, especially older ones that don't have analog controls, are very simple and all work pretty much the same way. Really, there are only 5 parts to a controller, and this holds true with those for any system. There's the casing that holds everything together, the board with the contacts inside, the rubber dome switches that make the buttons work, and the accompanying buttons on top of them, and the cable to connect to the console. Every controller is a variation on the same theme, just in a different shape. The first thing you're going to want to do is to get your controller open, and this is easily the most dangerous step. I bought this controller at an outdoor flea market for $1. Look at how gunked up it is. This thing probably spent the first half of its life lying in some kid's closet, and the second half of its life sitting at the bottom of a milk crate in direct sunlight and exposed to the elements. The screws holding the thing together are in horrible shape. Don't lose this battle for yourself before you even begin. The first and most important tool you're going to want to invest in, and this holds true no matter what part of a console you're working on, is a really decent set of screwdrivers. Preferably a set that has a lot of different driver types, including very small ones. Little Phillips head screws like this are really tiny landmines. They're the easiest screw type in the universe to strip out, and we don't want that to happen. If you have rusty screws like this holding a controller or console together, don't dive right in. Grab a little bit of penetrating oil or rust dissolver. Apply a little bit to each screw. Let it sit. Go play one of your other consoles for a while or something. I already applied some TC11 to these screws about an hour ago, so I knew they'd all come out, and so I wouldn't make myself look like an ass on film. Oh, and one more thing. Don't try and spray the penetrating oil from a can, knucklehead. A syringe is your best friend, or an eyedropper if you can't find one. Use the right size driver for the screws in question. Don't wing it. If you're not sure, test a couple of driver sizes to see which one locks best. These NES screws are number 1 Phillips, by the way. If you want to know the fastest way to strip them out, try using a bog standard number 2 Phillips head screwdriver on them. Preferably one from 1972 that you found in the bottom of your dad's toolbox. If your screws are all rusty and chewed up like this, do yourself a favor and replace them. Take them down to your local friendly neighborhood hardware store and get some replacements in stainless steel, or at least get some new ones that aren't all rusty. It's only going to cost you about $1 tops, and it'll make your life a lot easier when you go to take the controller apart again, or if you're going to sell it later. You hear me? If I wind up buying your old console gear and it's got some rusty stripped original screws that you just barely got out and decided to put back in, I'm going to hunt you down and kneecap you with an Xbox power supply. Sometimes your original screws will be in good shape and you can get them out without chewing them up. Reusing those will be fine. Just remember, don't reuse stripped out screws. Kneecap. Power supply. I'm watching you. Alright, did I talk about screws long enough? Screw them. Take the 2 halves of the casing apart. Inside there's the back of the board, and you can see the cable where all the wires are soldered in. And note how the cable is wrapped around these posts. That's for strain relief, so when your little brother throws the controller across the room, it doesn't rip all the soldered wires out. Pay attention to how that cable goes around the pegs, because you're going to want to put it back in the same way. While we're in here, do the solder connections to that wire look okay? If they don't, or even if they do, you might just want to poke them with a soldering iron a little bit to freshen them up. If you have wires busted off, strip them back and solder them back on. The wires going to NES controllers actually have crimp connectors on them, and these are soldered into place on the opposite side of the board. This is actually a lot stronger than the way most other controllers do it, which just has skinny little wires soldered directly to the board. Let's take a sidestep here for a second. Yeah, I know, you love it when I go all tangential like this, right? If you have a chewed up controller cord that you suspect has a break in it, you can check each wire in turn from this point with a multimeter. Just test each wire for continuity. If you have a break in one of the wires, you're best off just replacing the cable, which can be tricky. The best way I've found to do it is to get some durable multi-strand cable like, I don't know, a chunk of Cat5 network wire, hack off the original plug with a couple of inches of lead on it, and solder the Cat5 to it. This is really way too complicated an operation to do on here, and I'm not going to cut up a perfectly good cord just to show you. So you're on your own with that. Moving along, let's carefully lift the controller board out. Jesus, look at how grimy it is in here. On the back side of the board, you can see the contacts where the actual buttons meet and make the D-pad work, and all the buttons. These are your #1 point of failure. There's not a whole lot that can physically permanently go wrong with them, but over time they tend to get gunked up, and when they're dirty they don't make contact and they don't work very well. Probably the best thing you can do is clean these off, and you can use alcohol, isopropyl or denatured, or you can use purpose-made contact cleaner. I find this automotive stuff works pretty well. You want to make sure that these are as clean as possible. Being the #1 mechanical failure point means that making sure these contacts are as clean as they can be will probably have the best effect for restoring your old controller. Next, you'll see the rubber dome switches, which are, well, little rubber domes. They provide the spring action of the button, and these black contact patches here are what actually make contact with the traces on the board and make the buttons work. You can almost see on this one how it's got the pattern of the contact embossed into it. And that's not really pressed into the material, that's all dirt. So we want to wash that off. You can use the same contact cleaner or alcohol you used on the other side of the board. These are a little bit more tricky to clean off because it's even harder to tell when they're truly clean. In some rare cases you may find that your contact domes are actually damaged. They can be cracked or have holes in them, or the little black contact patches could fall off. If this happens, all isn't lost. You can loot contact patches from other things that use the same kind of key switch, either old, really broken console controllers, or more commonly broken TV remotes and that sort of thing. A little bit of crazy glue or contact cement will be the perfect thing to add these new contacts back onto your old rubber domes. Beyond these are the plastic buttons, the parts you actually press. You can take these out to clean them and to spruce them up, and also to clean any gunk out of the gaps between them and the casing, which can get into the works and cause the buttons to be hard to press or sticky. Now that you have everything out, it's a good idea to clean both halves of the casing, since once fully disassembled it's safe to do because there's no electronics in here. Your best bet is dish soap and a little bit of warm water. Don't make it too hot, especially with early NES controllers, because a lot of the decoration on these is actually just a big plastic sticker, and with too much heat or the wrong kind of solvent you can actually make this peel off. If that does happen, or if it's already happened to your controller, you can put it back on with a little bit of contact cement or even super glue if you're careful. Oh, and don't use the abrasive side of the sponge, dummy. Now it's time to put it all back together. The buttons go in first, and most of them have small pegs that fit in the little slots to orient them the right way. More complicated controllers might have slots that are different widths to ensure that the right button goes in the right place. The contact patches usually have holes in them that'll line up with pegs to ensure they get oriented the right way and to make sure they don't get put in the wrong place. On top of the buttons go the contact patches, and on top of the contact patches goes the circuit board. Lining this up is crucial, and again there are often pegs that meet up with holes to make sure that the board goes in the right spot and stays in place. Put the cable back in properly so that the strain relief works, and the back half of the casing goes on. The last step is putting the screws back in. This is a crucial thing. When you're putting your screws in, especially if you're reusing the old OEM screws, you don't need a whole lot of torque. You're not putting together the Sydney Harbor Bridge here. Just use light torque and as soon as the screwdriver stops, stop driving the screw. Trust me, if you don't over-torque your screws, you'll make matters a lot easier for the next time you have to take the controller apart. This really is all there is to it. In most cases, controller repair isn't all that difficult, and it's something you can do yourself. It's also something you should do yourself, because as collectors and classic gamers, the burden of keeping old consoles alive and running falls on our shoulders. If you keep your gear in good shape, you can help preserve it for future generations of gamers.